What's going on, everyone? Golden Tickets to History coming to you from the historic Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C. This is the final place where President Lincoln spent his final night before being shot. If you haven't done so already, please make sure to take a few moments to subscribe to the channel. We have so much historic locations, filming locations, haunted places, famous graves, true crime locations, theme parks, and so much more. Right in front of me, you can see the trunk, bag, and clothes that President Lincoln wore when he came into Washington, D.C. a week before inauguration. Right in front of me is a dagger, a pair of goggles, a pair of brass knuckles, and a few other items that he had in his possession when he came into D.C. Many of his supporters said that he needed to come in at nighttime, to which he was really adamant against because he was afraid of what type of message would it send to those who were opposed to him that he snuck in like a creature of the night into D.C. versus coming in through the front door. As you can see right in front of me, we have some of the pictures of the perpetrators who carried out the assassination attempt against Lincoln. Right in front of me here, we have Payne, or Mr. Powell. He was one of the conspirators to the assassination of Lincoln. He was executed for his part in the assassination, and eventually his head actually made its way all the way down to Florida, where his head was buried. Check out for a future video where I will take you to the final resting place of his head. As you can see here, there's a lot of descriptions on all the various different conspirators who assisted with the assassination. Right here in front of us is the actual assassinator, Mr. John Wilkes Booth, the famous actor at the time period who was very staunchly against Lincoln. Right in front of me right now is the Dillinger that was used to assassinate President Lincoln. This is the exact gun that was used. It was a really small pistol. It could only shoot one bullet out of it, and it's all it took, one bullet in the back of the head, right below the ear and the neckline of President Lincoln, that ultimately led to his succumbing to his injuries the next day. Here is a cast of the same pistol, so you can kind of get an idea of how large the pistol was. In the case across, you can see the actual pistol that was used. We're now walking into the theater. The theater has gone through many renovations. One of the biggest renovations was the fact not long after the assassination, they completely gutted the entire theater with the hopes that it would never be a theater again. It wasn't until the 1960s that it really started to take on its current look and appearance, where all of the interior was recasted. The chairs, the balcony, the stage is all not original. The chairs are from about 2002-2003 time period, where they gutted them out to try to make them more comfortable. The previous chairs that was here since the 1960s were more period based, so they actually really fit what chairs would have been in there the night when Lincoln was assassinated. These chairs, on the other hand, are not historically accurate to the time period, but are historically accurate to a certain time period and are a little bit more comfortable than the period chairs from before. Right in front of me, you can see the presidential balcony that was used by Lincoln and ultimately where the assassination took place. It was a two-door balcony. It was where originally future President Grant was supposed to come join with his wife. Ultimately, they had to change plans the night before. They had an opportunity to go visit with family. I believe it was the children who were coming into town, so they took that advantage over coming to the play where Lincoln ultimately was assassinated. But right across there on the right side, the taller chair was the one where the exact place where Lincoln was assassinated.
Pretty much point blank range. We think it's probably about 6 inches or maybe just a little bit more away from the president's head. A bullet's going to enter below the left ear. It travels through the two hemispheres of the brain. There's no exit wound. It lodges behind the right eyeball socket. The president Lincoln immediately slumps forward in the chair, losing consciousness. So that's where he was located. Other questions you might have about the assassination or the theater? Yes. Diagram of the theater and how he was able to access the box. It naturally intrigues people. But there's nothing really elaborate about it. He's not using a ladder, he's not using a rope, he's not sneaking up behind. He just goes over by the door and talks to an assistant to the president, and we don't know what he says. But in that era, the 19th century, there's a relative degree of easy access to the president. And so presumably, as an actor of some notoriety, all you have to say is something on the level of, I'd like to pay my respects to President Lincoln. And that sounds plausible enough, he's let inside. So he just goes in through that outer door, and then beyond that outer door, about 6 to 7 feet in, is an inner door. And he just opens that door prior to the biggest applause line in the third and final act, and that's when he fires the shot. Other questions that you might have? Yes?
Do you guys still have the gun that you shot with?
Do we still have the gun? Yes, it's in our collection. So in the museum down below the theater, they have the gun that was used in the assassination. Just to kind of give you a sense of the size of the gun and the type of gun, if you hold up the palm of your hand, basically the gun is the same size as the palm of your hand. The bullet itself, the gun only holds one bullet. The bullet's very small. It's about the size of the nail on your pinky finger. And that particular Derringer, which is manufactured in Philadelphia, it has a special molding kit for the bullet. It does not work interchangeably with other guns or even the same model of that gun. It just works with that exact gun, that molding kit for the bullet. And that's the bullet that's used that kills Abraham Lincoln. If you had top of the hour tickets, so we have 11 o'clock tickets and 11:30 tickets, is that correct? So if you had top of the hour tickets, that ticket gets you into the museum. The 11:30 is often people with a little less time, and you come directly in the theater, but you bypass the museum below us. So that's where the artifacts are kept today. And I know for a lot of people, they say, well, why would they cut the theater? This sounds really kind of harsh to say, but it's not unlike a school shooting where the community says, we don't want any thought of that anymore. We're just going to bulldoze it and do something else with the site. So that's kind of how some people are feeling about the theater after the assassination. They don't want it to be used as a theater ever again, and so they just gut it on the inside. Not long after that, John T. Ford, the theater owner, he's going to be compensated for the loss of the theater by the government. That is to say, the government buys the building outright from him. And then the government will use this space on and off again as a warehouse and office space for government clerks. It's going to be reconstructed in the 1960s, takes them about 2.5 years, and it reopens to the public in January of 1968. And it's been an active National Historic Site and theater ever since. Other questions that you might have? Yes, he did. It's about 11-foot leap onto the stage. So he swings over the balustrade here, and as he does so, the spur on his boot, one of the spurs, is going to catch in the blue Treasury Guard flag here, so it snags in the fabric, and that causes him to land awkwardly on the stage. He was very often cast in swashbuckling roles. He's a very athletic actor, and he would make dramatic entrances at times into a role on the stage, jumping onto the stage. So it was something he was accustomed to doing. Now, everything I read as a child about the assassination seemed to indicate that when he jumped onto the stage, he broke the fibula in his left leg. We're not entirely convinced of that anymore. Historians that have looked at eyewitness accounts, there are hundreds of eyewitness accounts. No one talks about seeing John Wilkes Booth walk or run with any kind of limp. And furthermore, he is observed by other eyewitnesses in the back alley, putting all that pressure on the left leg before he mounts the horse. Even with adrenaline running through your body, that's going to be kind of difficult to do. So people are less inclined to definitively say he broke the fibula here when he jumped onto the stage. The bricks outside, the wood for the doors, the wood around the windows and doors, that's 90% or more original. And the same goes for the brick wall back here in Baptist Alley behind the theater. So the outer shell of the theater is largely original, but the inside was gutted. Other questions that you might have? Yes?
You mentioned that the interior of the theater was gutted afterwards, and how you compared that to like modern day school shootings about how they just want to get rid of it. Was there any backlash from the public towards the other actors who were in the performance, like an actor shot at maybe they're all in on it?
I think for the federal officials that are conducting the investigation, it's a military tribunal that actually finds all the conspirators guilty. It's not a civil trial. So it's a military tribunal. So it's still being considered as an aspect of the Civil War, the way they're prosecuting it. But they do have a lot of questions for actors and for people that worked at the theater. So for example, Ned Spangler, Ned Spangler is the stagehand and kind of jack of all trades here at the theater, carpenter and handyman. He's the one that goes to the door and talks with John Wilkes Booth when John Wilkes Booth first comes down the alley on his rented horse at about 10 o'clock. And he was known to be a Confederate sympathizer. That said, there are a lot of Confederate sympathizers here in Washington, D.C. It's a rife for them. So there was some speculation that he might have been in on the crime. He's not hanged like the other conspirators, but he will be given a sentence down in the drive-thru.
We know from eyewitness accounts that more likely than not, no one rented out these boxes. These were kind of the luxury boxes of their era. And so they were very expensive compared to the other box. Furthermore, the acoustics weren't that great. You couldn't always see all the actors here on the stage. And so we think that no one rented out the boxes here. And many nights, these boxes would sit empty. They just were not sold. And so this was kind of a special occasion. Does that get your question? Did I answer your question? Okay, excellent.
Cumulative about 15, 20 minutes. How hot and humid is it outside? Uncomfortable? Did you feel kind of comfortable when you came in here? How would you have felt if you entered the theater for an afternoon matinee about this time of year in 1865? And then if you drank a lot of water or coffee and you needed to go to the restroom. And then the two guests of Mary Lincoln, that's Clara Harris and Major Rathbone, her fiance. So those are the four occupants of the box. They show up by carriage for Lincoln's dinner party at about 8:30 with the play already underway. They alight from the carriage, they come off of 10th Street, and they come into the lobby here, and then eventually up the spiral staircase and into the balcony. As that famous 6'4" frame comes into view, there's just one actor here on the stage. That's the famous actor Laura Keene. Laura Keene, upon seeing the president, immediately motions down to the orchestra pit in front of her, and they're going to strike up Hail to the Chief. People rise up out of their seats. There's cheers and applause as the Lincolns and their two guests come across and take their seats. The play gets back underway. John Wilkes Booth is going to knock at the backstage door. This is all concealed by the scenery of the play that night. But there's a stage door back here. He's going to knock at the backstage door and look for somebody to tend to his rented horse while he goes inside for a bit. As he comes inside, he eventually wanders over to this wing. This is also concealed from the audience at this time, but over this wing is a trap door. And he opens up that trap door. He's able to go down underneath the stage by way of a passageway while the play is underway, and out a trap door in this wing, also concealed from the view of the audience. He then goes up the alleyway between the theater and the establishment next door here on 10th Street. He turns left onto 10th Street, and he enters that establishment. That's the Star Saloon. He goes inside, orders a whiskey, and then he comes back to the theater. And when he comes back to the theater, he enters off of 10th Street, the formal entrance, the same place that the Lincolns had come in earlier. He comes up into the balcony, and eventually wanders over closer to the door, and he sees somebody off to the side. That's Mr. Charles Forbes, serving as the footman for the carriage that night, serves as kind of a personal messenger to the president. He talks with Mr. Forbes. We don't know what is said, but that is an era of the 19th century of relatively easy access to the president. He's an extremely famous actor, and all he has to say is something on the order of, "I'd like to pay my respects to President Lincoln." So he's going to be led inside. He goes into the outer door. Once the outer door is shut, on the opposite end, in that small vestibule, he finds a broken off music stand, and he takes that piece of wood and wedges it into the door, right behind the door, into that frame to barricade himself inside. About 6 to 7 feet off of this outer door is an inner door leading directly into the box. And there's a hole that's been placed in that door months prior. He's able to look through that hole and see the back of President Lincoln engrossed in the play. The biggest applause line in the third and final act is about to be uttered. And so he's going to step very quietly in behind President Lincoln. He's lurking behind the president on the president's left side. The applause line is uttered, as is typical. Lots of applause and laughter as that applause line is uttered, and the gunshot goes off. And we know from eyewitness accounts that many in the audience do not report hearing the gunshot. President Lincoln immediately slumps forward in the chair, losing consciousness. He'll not regain it again. And ultimately, Major Rathbone on the back end of the box, he'll get up and a struggle will ensue between Rathbone and Booth. John Wilkes Booth drops that single-shot derringer to the floor of the box. He pulls out a long Bowie knife and he goes to stab at Major Rathbone, and he winds up hitting him in the arm, all the way down to the bone. Rathbone's bleeding profusely and he staggers back. Then John Wilkes Booth prepares to swing over the balustrade, making an 11-foot leap onto the stage. And as he does so, one of his spurs is going to catch in the blue Treasury Guard flag. We have a replica of it on the pole right behind the portrait of George Washington. But snags in that fabric and he lands awkwardly on the stage. Booth then gets up, walks to center stage, holds aloft that bloody knife, and shouts out, "Sic semper tyrannis." It's a Latin expression. It translates roughly as "thus always to tyrants." In other words, in front of all the theater patrons gathered here that night, he's calling out our 16th president as a tyrant. He runs out the backstage door, mounts his horse, and he's going to ride quickly down Baptist Alley. He turns right onto F Street. He's riding east across the district, over Capitol Hill, eventually across the district line and into Maryland. Days later into southern Maryland, and many days later still, across the Potomac River and into northern Virginia. And it's on the 12th day that he's on this escape. He's going to be surrounded in a tobacco barn at the Garrett Farm in Virginia, surrounded by Union soldiers, refusing to give himself up. I'll get to John Wilkes Booth in just a moment. But as for President Lincoln, initially no one can get into the barricaded door, and people start to funnel into the box. Now, one of the first doctors in is Dr. Charles Leal, relatively fresh out of Union Army medical training, and he comes into the box, and he saw the bloody knife wielded by John Wilkes Booth. Many people did. So initially he thinks that the president's been stabbed. But as he gets closer to the president, looks at the condition of his eyes, probes for a wound and finds it, it dawns on him that the president's been shot, not stabbed. And he's going to be joined by 2 other doctors. And regrettably, these 3 doctors are of a consensus. This is a fatal wound. They're giving the president at best perhaps 2 or 3 hours to survive. There are many soldiers that are attending the play, and some of them come up into the balcony to see what's going on, to see if they can help. So under the doctor's orders, many of the soldiers volunteer to carry the president. So they carry the president across the balcony, down the spiral staircase, out onto 10th Street. And because the doctors are looking for a bed nearby, the soldiers are calling out for any available bed, knocking on doors in vain, when all of a sudden, a door opens across the street at Peterson boarding house. There's one boarder home. He opens that front door, steps out on the stoop, sees the tumult out in the street, and he calls to the soldiers and says, "Bring him in here, bring him in here." They'll bring him into a back bedroom. Now the doctors are wrong about one thing. President Lincoln has a very sturdy constitution, and he's going to survive a lot longer than 2 or 3 hours. He survives a little longer than 9 hours. But early the next morning, Saturday, April 15th, 1865, at 7:22 a.m., Lincoln breathes his last. As for John Wilkes Booth, after making his escape from this theater, in that 12th day of his escape, he's in a tobacco barn there at the Garrett Farm. He's surrounded by Union soldiers, refusing to give himself up, and the soldiers are getting frustrated with this. So somebody gets the idea to light the tobacco barn on fire to try and smoke John Wilkes Booth out. For some of the soldiers that are gathered closer in, they think they're catching glimpses of John Wilkes Booth between some of the gaps in the woody slats of the barn. Some of the soldiers that are closer in still are convinced that John Wilkes Booth is raising up with a firearm to shoot at them. Well, Boston Corbett of the New York Regiment Cavalry, he's going to take out a revolver. He fires a shot. That bullet's going to hit John Wilkes Booth in the back, severing his spinal column. He's going to live about 2 more hours after that. Booth is going to be dragged out of the barn and up onto a porch there at the Garrett Farm. And he says a few things before he dies, but his very final words while he's looking at his hands are simple. He says, "Useless, useless." Now, why would he say this? More likely than not, in plotting his assassination, John Wilkes Booth thought that there might be other people, perhaps people that had fought on behalf of the Confederacy, that would hail him as a hero. People that despised Lincoln in the same way he did. But he's disavowed this notion while he makes his escape. He's given a Virginia newspaper that had long been sympathetic to the Confederacy throughout the Civil War, and instead of calling him out as a hero in their coverage of his assassination and escape, again and again he's being called a coward. So he's risked everything. He's tarnished the name of his famous acting family. Here's the far more difficult thing to think about in terms of what he does, because it's the opposite of what he intends. I told you at the beginning of my talk that historians often say you need some critical distance before you fairly evaluate a president. We have 2 prominent examples of this in the 20th century. One is a Democratic president, the other a Republican. These 2 individuals, after they left office, 5, 10, 15 years out, famous historians and presidential historians rank these individuals in the bottom quarter of presidents. Again and again, they were seen as failures. Look at those 2 names today, and invariably you'll find them in the top quarter of presidents. They're considered some of our better presidents today. And I'm speaking specifically here of Harry S. Truman and Dwight Eisenhower. there's no such lengthy timetable like this for Abraham Lincoln. Because of the very rash act by John Wilkes Booth, in this theater, at the tail end of the Civil War, it actually speeds up that timetable for people to better assess and appreciate the challenges faced by Abraham Lincoln. I thank you for joining me here today. I'll stay after if you have questions.
It was here at the Peterson House, a 19th century federal-style row house and boarding house on 10th Street Northwest in Washington, D.C., where Lincoln ultimately succumbed to his injuries from being shot behind the ear with a Dillinger by John Wilkes Booth. So I'm going to show you here in just a moment is the room where Lincoln passed away. The bed in this room is not the exact bed from when he was here, but is a replica of what the bed would have looked like. The actual bed, I believe, is in Illinois, where they keep it at a display in a museum. So if you want to take and see that, you have the opportunity. So this chair here, this bed here is not the original bed from the time period, but it is a period bed from that time period. It's not the exact one that Lincoln laid in when he took his final breaths in this room. But this is the actual room where Lincoln succumbed to his injuries. So it's kind of cool to think to be the idea to be in the same room where one of the most prolific leaders in American history and world history, and a president who expanded the rights and powers of the presidency and expanded the Constitution to unparalleled levels, took his final breaths. It's kind of surreal to think about. This is out towards the backside of the boarding house for those who have not seen it. There was a museum that's connected to the Peterson House that you can go through and see a lot of different artifacts about his presidency and more context beyond just the assassination. Right outside is the Star Saloon. This is a replica, I believe, of where the saloon was, where John Wilkes Booth went and took his last drink before carrying out the assassination of Abraham Lincoln. Based off of what I've heard from reports, the Star Saloon was actually a block or so away. This is a replica to keep everything concisely together. As always, continue to look for the history and film. Hopefully you enjoyed this video. Please make sure to subscribe and to share it with others. Catch you guys in the next vlog. Have a wonderful day, everyone. See you guys next time. Continue to look for the history and film.